Welcome everybody this evening to the annual Ronald Tress Memorial Lecture here at Birkbeck. I'm Jeff Walters, for those of you that don't know me. I'm the Dean of the School of Business, Economics and Informatics, and it's my pleasure to welcome you all, staff, students, alumni, guests, to this evening's lecture hosted by the Department of Economics, Mathematics and Statistics. A special welcome also to members of the Tress family who are joining us this evening, and in particular to our guest speaker, Chris Giles, the economics editor for the Financial Times. Chris will deliver a lecture on the importance of communicating economics in the modern world, and in particular how the move towards an increasingly polarised society raises challenges for policymakers, academics and journalists. Promises to be a thought-provoking and interesting presentation, and I'm pleased to welcome Chris here, welcome him back to Birkbeck, as he previously studied for an MSc Economics here in the early 1990s, and I believe was taught by Ron, one of our long-standing members in the department. My colleague, Dr. Ken Horry, head of the department, will introduce Chris to you all in more detail shortly, but before I hand over to Ken, I just want to say a few short words to introduce this lecture. This is the 10th anniversary of the Ronald Tress Memorial Lecture, an annual event run by the department in honour of Ronald Tress, an extremely influential economist. Between 1941 and 1945, Tress was economic advisor to the British War Cabinet, and he played a vital role in the development of the post-war Marshall Plan for Western European economic recovery. He subsequently became Professor of Political Economy at the University of Bristol in 1951 before joining Birkbeck as Master in 1968, a role he held until 1977, after which he was elected a Fellow of the College and also became Director of the Levy-Hume Trust. He was responsible for creating the Department of Economics in 1972, with this year obviously being the 50th anniversary of the department. I've also been told he was a very financially prudent master, whereas other masters have expensive oil paintings made of them. He insisted on just a drawing that we have displayed in our council room. The year that Tress left Birkbeck in 1977 was also the same year he published an article in the Political Quarterly entitled "The University's Alternative in Quaternary Education," where he discussed how universities were not static institutions in regard to their teaching, the research they pursue, or the people they serve. However, he also recognised they're slow-moving and often cannot contemplate doing anything other than what they're doing at that particular time. For those of us that work in higher education and in Birkbeck, I'm sure this is something we can all recognise. What was particularly interesting, however, was how he also argued that universities are capable of remarkable changes whilst remaining true to their essential selves. He also argued universities have become too focused on 18 to 25-year-olds. This, I can assume, was coming from his 9-year experience as Master at Birkbeck and his intimate understanding of providing higher education opportunities to adults. I think his thoughts on higher education 45 years ago are incredibly relevant to this day and to Birkbeck for two reasons. First, the COVID pandemic has meant we are living through a period of rapid change in higher education. We're having to learn new ways of working, of delivering our teaching, and ensuring that we are increasingly flexible to meet student needs in ways that might not seem possible 2 years ago. In Birkbeck, as is the case across the UK and globally, we made the shift to offer online learning and continue to seek to understand how to retain the best elements of this to ensure a strong blended approach for our students. What we've learnt over the past 2 years is shaping the way we adapt our teaching for our current and future students. Second, the government's recent commitment to the lifelong loan entitlement recognises the virtues of lifelong learning and the importance of all forms of education, not just higher education for adults. This is critical, as the need for reskilling and upskilling, of course, involves educating adults. These developments might be happening almost 45 years after Tress wrote about this, but it doesn't take away from the fact that we need universities more than ever to serve a broader demographic than the 18 to 25-year-old student. This has been the guiding principle of Birkbeck for almost 200 years, with our commitment to flexible higher education courses for students of all ages. And I therefore believe we are well placed to contribute to the lifelong learning agenda. This is also something we are firmly focused on in the business school, with the recent launch of our Centre for Professional Development and the delivery of the government's Help to Grow management scheme for SMEs. We're proud to host the annual Ronald Tress Memorial Lecture as a way to honour his legacy and contribution by inviting a leading figure in the field to speak on the pressing issues affecting society today. I'm therefore delighted to welcome Chris this evening and you all to the lecture this evening, and particularly because it's the first time in 3 years that we've been able to host this in person. So it's nice to see everybody this evening. I will now pass you over to my colleague Ken Horry, the head of the Department of Economics, Mathematics and Statistics, and I hope you all have an enjoyable evening. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jeff. Mr. Chris Giles is, as you now have heard, is a columnist at the Financial Times and has been its economics editor since 2004. Chris has a particular focus on trends in the world economy and in the UK. Previously at the Financial Times, he was the economics lead writer. Chris has won the prestigious Wincott Award for Journalism in 2014 and the British Journalism Awards Business Journalist of the Year prize in 2012. He has also won the Royal Statistical Society Prize for Excellence in Journalism in both 2008 and 2012. Actually, that might be slightly out-of-date information. Any more since? No, okay. Before joining the FT in 2000, Chris was an economics correspondent at the BBC, so he must be on TV. Before that, he started his career in research, spending 7 years as an economist for the Institute of Fiscal Studies. I have for many years enjoyed reading Chris's articles in the FT. If Martin Wolf is slightly incomprehensible and you read Robert Strimsley's columns for a good laugh, Chris's articles are very readable and they make you nod and say, yeah, I agree, most of the times. In one of his recent articles, he calls for politicians to, and I quote, use an approach that draws on lessons from many different social sciences to reduce energy consumption in order to minimize Putin's leverage. Chris lists history, which shows the success of using emergency appeals, economics, which tells us that behavior responds to price incentives at the margin, behavioral science, which suggests use of nudge, and data science. This is a perfect demonstration of Chris's skill in being able to connect academic theories to policy suggestions, which makes his articles readable and very interesting to both academics and the general public. Chris graduated from Cambridge in 1991, which actually means that he and I overlapped for 2 years, though I didn't have the pleasure of meeting him then. But we're very proud to say that he did then the MSc Economics at Birkbeck from 1992 to 1994. Chris mentioned to me in his emails that there were more equations at Birkbeck than at Cambridge. Whoops. Maybe that's changed a bit. Though he himself sought to avoid math at most opportunities. Anyway, I was very pleased to find out earlier this year that Chris is one of our alumni and has gone on to establish a very successful career since graduating from Birkbeck. So without further ado, I'd like you all to give a very warm welcome to this year's Ronald Tress Memorial Lecturer speaker, Mr. Chris Giles.
Thank you very much, Ken and Jeff, for a really very kind introduction. And I'm very delighted to be here back at Birkbeck for the first time in nearly 30 years, I think. And it does remind me very much of my time here. The tiredness, the hard work, the excellent insights into econometrics from Ron Smith. In the early 90s, of course, it wasn't here. It was the other side of Tottenham Court Road. And I was clear at the time that I thought I needed a master's in economics for an economics career. But studying here wasn't just a signal. It certainly gave me real benefits in my career since and in the economics field in my working life. But I also don't think we should decry the signal it sends when you've completed a degree at Birkbeck, because let's face it, if you can hold down a full-time job and do a part-time degree at the same time, you can show any employer, you can demonstrate to any employer that you're not afraid of hard work. So it's a rare privilege for me today to come and give the Ronald Tress Memorial Lecture, and I'm going to talk about what I've spent most of my career doing in one form or another, and that is communicating economics to the public, whether it's at the IFS or at the BBC, which only a very short time, or for quite a long time at the Financial Times. I'm quite conscious that I do quite a lot of giving my opinion on what's going on in either the global economy or the UK economy. I'm not going to talk a lot about that today, but I'm very happy to answer questions about that later. And just let me say at the outset how I define economics. I don't define it as the study of unlimited wants and scarce resources as my daughter is being taught doing A-level economics. I think it's much broader than that. I think it's the study of how the world works and how to make it a better place. And so why do we want to get this study across to the public? Well, I think when you're thinking about communications, it's sort of three things. You want the public to be able to understand economics in some form or another, not necessarily in any great depth, so they can make better private, personal decisions for themselves. But then in the public sphere, you want them to be able to elect governments that care about good economics, and also that then is quite a good defence against pretty ugly politics, which we see in many places around the world, particularly at the moment. But there is quite a view circulating among economists, and certainly academic economists. I was in a conference just a couple of weeks ago in Chicago, which was steeped in this view that, one, economists aren't trusted by the public, two, the public don't understand, and so three, the intermediaries, that's me, who sit in between the two, must be doing an absolutely terrible job. And it's all a disaster. And this being quite introspective, I am going to address this specifically, and there's some truth in that, I've got to admit. But it is occasionally bleak when we're trying to get messages across, and there is occasionally a really bad world out there in media land. And I will mention the B word, that's not Birkbeck, it's Brexit. But it's not going to be just doom and gloom. I think this is actually quite a nuanced story. We need to recognise that economics is hugely influential in modern public life. And much of the communication of that is actually excellent. So, and in other cases, it's not the fault of communication why you don't like the outcomes. That might just be democracy. It might just be that there is something out there you don't really like, but other people like it more than you. And one thing I am particularly sort of often irritated by, where economics deals in trade-offs. There isn't necessarily a right or wrong. It's a trade-off, and people can take different views on the trade-off. Inequality is one of them, and I sort of despair, quite often we hear in the public debate the use of the word progressive being a synonym for good, especially, and that's just not true if there's a trade-off between equity and efficiency. I'm not saying it's bad either. And so you can get into these debates about, if you take an example recently, the proposal by the Dilnot Commission to have a cap on the costs of social care for elderly people, so that you pay up to a cap will be £80,000, let's say, and then after that the taxpayers pay, the state comes in. So this isn't about trying to redistribute income from rich to poor. This is about correcting a market failure. This market doesn't exist. People would like to be able to buy this insurance, but for various reasons, good reasons, it doesn't exist. So it doesn't matter that it's actually regressive, which is a criticism that both Theresa May occasionally from the Conservative Party and parts of the Labour Party have made. We have to think about this, about the economics involved, not necessarily about the distribution. We have to think about distribution at other times, of course. So I'm going to look at some of the triumph. I'm going to tell some stories here. I'm going to look at some of the triumph and disasters in communication economics this century. I'm going to look at 4 examples: the global financial crisis, the austerity debate, Brexit, and COVID. But first, because I'm here in an academic institution. I think we do need to define some terms. And I'm going to talk a little bit about how economics journalism actually works, which I think a lot of people don't quite know. Sometimes academics think they do know. For example, there's a staff working paper at the Bank of England, really quite recently, I think it's October last year. Mark my words, the transmission of central bank communication to the general public via the print media. So they really are knowing exactly how we work here. This is telling us how the FT works. And this is the economic problem as they saw it. We consider a representative newspaper that is a profit maximizer. Well, that's pretty accurate. We certainly want to make profits, whether we do or don't is a different matter. We can think of the newspaper's problem as more accurately being described as the journalist's problem. Yeah, don't have any problem with that. So here's my task. The journalist tasked with economic reporting has one choice variable, K. K represents the fraction of an article that directly paraphrases the central bank. Now, I think we do have to think about how much we paraphrase the central bank when we report on them, but I think we have many more than one choice variables, as I will demonstrate in a second. And then writing news that satisfies consumers' desires will sell more papers, but requires effort. Paraphrasing the central bank may not align with consumer desires, but is costless. So this is all about telling central banks that they have to just feed us with stuff that's really easy to Control-C, Control-V, and we can copy it down because we're fundamentally extremely lazy. That isn't how journalism works, but it isn't. I'm not going to suggest it's particularly pure either. So the key thing I have to do on a day-to-day basis is keep these people happy. This is the FT's main news desk. The news editor at the moment is this guy here, Matt. And he's very happy in this photo because clearly someone has delivered copy on time. It's clear, it's a good story, it's going to work very well on the front page of the newspaper and it's going to splash on the website. And that is what makes Matt happy. What sort of things is it that makes him happy? Well, the first thing, one of the most important things I have to do is a thing that we call news judgment. I need to know what's newsworthy and I need to make those decisions. I don't need him to tell me because he's got other things he needs to do. He has to decide between my stories and other people's about which is best. But he has to trust me that I know what a good story is and what is useful and important for our readers. And the key question I have to ask myself in making any news judgment is, why does it matter? So what? What's important about this? But that question can change day to day because news, unfortunately, is relative. What's important on one day will be less important on another. If a country's just been invaded, for example, economics news isn't going to make it anywhere near Matt's eyes, and he'd be very cross if I tried to bother him with it. On other times, in the summer, when nothing else is going on, a really boring piece of economics data will suddenly become extremely exciting to him. And the poor sod, I often try and go away on the summer as well because I don't really like having to flam up, the latest retail sales numbers into something very important for the economy. But that just shows news really is relative. And that is why people who are sensible and have reports to publish often put them out on a Sunday because there's less news than on Monday's paper or on a Monday news cycle. And people know this as well in the game. But also, one other part of news judgment is also trying to report stories simply and clearly for readers. Because readers are busy and they don't have a lot of time and they want to get what's important really quickly. So let me give you a concrete example of this. And when I say concrete, sadly it is a terrible pun. I'm talking about very deep down in the Bank of England. This is 3 floors underground. And it is the place where journalists go to be locked in to the Bank of England. All phones have to be locked away in cupboards and all internet communication is down. And we get to see the Bank of England's interest rate decisions and their assessment of the economy 2 hours before it goes public. So highly market sensitive. We all get locked in this room. We get a briefing from some Bank of England staff. This was last Thursday, by the way. Last Thursday, it was really clear. We had a really good story. We all knew we had a good story on the hands because the Bank of England had raised interest rates to 1% from 0.75%. It's the highest rate in 13 years. But they also forecast the slide of the economy into recession as energy bills would take inflation up to double-digit levels for the first time in 40 years. Now, this really is a good story. And it was pretty clear to us in the room, because obviously we chat about it and we've got 2 hours, so you don't have to, writing a 600-word news story on this probably takes about half an hour maximum. So you've got a lot of material to go through, and you can also have a bit of coffee there on the right, and you can have a chat, and you get briefing from from some officials who are generally helpful, because they want to get across. This isn't that it is all entirely off the record. It's just to try and they will tell you what they think is important in there. You don't have to take any notice, but they're generally pretty. They're not normally trying to spin in that environment. And it was pretty clear to us all there that this was a story of the economic forecast being terrible, really awful, and yet the Bank of England was raising interest rates, so it was going to kick us a bit more as the public and as companies, even when they thought the economic outlook was really bad. Yet you didn't really get that from the minutes. If you would go through that, there wasn't the killer quote, which just sort of summarised it in one sentence, and nor was there anything in the whole document really that worked for that. And I was thinking, this is a real pain. Because what you really want to do, because I was going to say, that is going to be my story. That's my news judgment of what's important here. But the Bank of England hasn't given me that nice sentence, which will paraphrase their views, although they wouldn't necessarily wanted to put it in that language. It was much, much more boring than that, the way they described it. So we then go to a press conference. And this is a press conference from last Thursday. And I thought, I really just need... my incentive in that press conference was I didn't really want to challenge them. We had a great story. There was nothing. We weren't going to get a better story than was in all the documents and their forecasts. So I just wanted to get a summarising, pithy quote. So I thought I'd ask them quite a direct, short question, which was, what do you say to households who feel that when they're down, you've just given them another kick? Short questions are always much better than long questions. It gives people less time to think. Alistair Darling told me that. He was always scared when there was a short question. Normally, an economics journalist asks really long, boring questions, and that's certainly a bad tactic. And all I was wanting was actually a quote to use, but I got 4-minute answer. That's the answer. Which basically said it was a carefully calibrated response, blah, 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 blah. It was utterly unusable. And so what did I do with it? Well, just looking, so the top of the story just says what happened, warned the economy will slide into recession. This year's energy prices push inflation above 10%. We added the sterling thing later on when we knew the market reaction. Despite forecasting a severe fall in household incomes, the bank's Monetary Policy Committee voted on Thursday to squeeze them further, raising the main interest rate a quarter point to 1%. And this is when you want a quote, just summarising it. Someone can read 3 paragraphs, then they can leave. They don't have to stay on reading the rest of the article. We know that people leave. It's quite shocking when we look at our readership statistics, how far people actually scroll down articles. You want to get everything up the top. So I then had to cobble together, various things. I had to say the MPC said it was unable to prevent, so that was in the minutes. And I haven't taken anything out of context here, and I haven't done anything naughty here. It's just that I didn't have anything. You want one sentence, I just didn't have it. Was unable to prevent UK households from becoming worse off, and its role was to ensure the inflation came down to the 2% target. And Andrew Bailey, governor, said there was a very sharp slowdown. He understood that higher energy prices would hurt. I recognise the hardship this was caused. It was okay, it was fine, but it'd be much better to have a single quote. So my incentive at the time was all about just trying to get them to say something that was newsworthy. I wasn't going to change our news judgment, because that's what we make, not what they make. But I did want it, I would have much preferred it to have been easier to write. So that's one form of news, just writing news. Something happens, you write it down. But there's lots of other forms of news writing in economics. You know, we do analytical pieces on the same day, because it was the 25th anniversary of the Bank of England's independence. We did an analytical piece of what's happened over 25 years of UK economic history. And we had quotes from Mervyn King, second on the left, and from Mark Carney. We phoned them both up, and they were willing to talk, saying that they had, well, it was now facing the biggest inflation challenge since independence. You can do nicer things. You can have long-running graphs showing how interest rates used to bobble around 5% or even higher in the late 80s, early 90s. And then after the financial crisis in 2008, 2009, they've really barely been above zero until very recently. And yet inflation is now suddenly taking off. You can do fun things like that. You can look at the record of the Bank of England's independence. So 10 years prior, you can see the pink is the volatility and the blue is the levels. So GDP per head in the first decade of independence was the same as previously, but volatility was much lower. That's a really good outcome. But since the financial crisis, it's all looked a bit terrible. So we have really low GDP per head, very high volatility, exactly what you don't want. Not blaming in any sense the Bank of England for that. Much bigger forces in the UK economy have done that. But that was the outcome. And also we looked at the banks really, again, not necessarily their fault, although some of it is, shocking inflation forecast changes. So that each time we've had a report recently, this time last year, May 2021, they thought inflation might just peak at sort of 2.5%, and now it's going to be now they're forecasting over 10% in the autumn of this year. Other forms of economics writing we do is opinion, so a column badged as opinion. You can see right at the top there, very clear that all that's saying is this is what I think. I'll try and bring some evidence to bear, but it's very much badged. This is I'm not reporting anyone there. I'm saying what I think. So just the sort of words I would use rather than that sort of dry, I understand academic economics has to simplify, but I think we have incentives to do much more than just decide how lazy we're going to be and paraphrase the central bank. I think we're doing these words, and I don't put them in any particular order, but entertain, explain, challenge, opine, report, analyse. Those are the sorts of things we're doing at different times in different places. And so our incentives are pretty messy and pretty complicated and change over time. But if I look at, so those are our incentives, but then look at it from the other actors here, with both the providers of economic data, so I mean policymakers, academics, private sector companies, and then the public. How does this all merge together in the public space? So how do we get this across? How does it get across to the public? So what's the ugly truth about this? Well, this is how much economists are trusted by the public. It was a Bristol University study from 2019. So on the left there, you can see the two bars of trust a fair amount and trust a great deal. If you add them up, a little bit over 35% of the public trust economists when they are just the opinions of economists on issues related to the national and world economy. And it is lower than the people who distrust them either very much or at all. So there's a bit of a problem out there for economics and the economics profession as a whole. And to put this in context, let's compare economics. It's a different survey, unfortunately not consistent, but with other professions. And you see that about 35% is pretty low down, the score. Professors, as a whole, get 81%. So I don't know what happens to an economics professor, but whether you're held up by the professor title or brought down by being an economist, let's say, I'm not going to ignore journalists at 28%. So economics journalists really are the lowest of the low. So there's definitely a problem about how much economics is believed by the public and by the intermediaries, so us lot as well. But it's not just a problem of the profession, it's also a problem of the public, I think. And I think, frankly, we have to say, objectively, the public is pretty rubbish in their understanding of economic concepts. So this was a study done by ESCO, the Economics Statistics Centre of Excellence, and they did a really good report on what does the public understand. And so here was just one aspect. What do you think GDP is? And they asked people to say what GDP was compared with, they offered them, does it mean something to do with the economy's size? Does it mean something to do with exports, wages, or government deficit? So there was a 1 in 4 chance. So if it was random, it'd be 25%. So the average answer was under 50%. So better than nothing, that they thought it was something to do with economic size. Men better than women, older better than younger people, higher educated better than lower educated. But really, in all levels, quite low. And also, there is a disconnect between stuff that we treat as just commonplace, like what is the unemployment rate, and what the public think about it. So when they were asked, what do you make of the fact that unemployment is 3.8%, do you think that's accurate or inaccurate? And quite a significant majority, a lot of don't knows, but of the people who had a view thought it was inaccurate. And then when they were asked a bit more, that's more because they had a perfectly good concept of unemployment. They just didn't have the ILO definition in mind. They had unemployment meaning non-employment, so anyone who was non-participating or formally unemployed, so we're talking about 25% of working age people, is what they had in mind. And so we have some problems about terms we use and numbers we use. So you put this all together and you give these stark statistics. Public don't trust economists, certainly not journalists, and they themselves have a weak understanding of the subject, and so it's quite easy to despair and give up. And sometimes I do come to that conclusion, but this is the very long, I'm sorry about this very, very long introduction, but I think we need to set out what we know is that there are messy and complex incentives on all sides. And why should the public know much more? Why should they care? Why is it important to them? And when we look at how economics communication works in practice, I don't think it's as miserable and as a terrible a story in all cases as it can sometimes seem. So in journalism we do like to talk about stories. So I'm going to talk about 4 really big economic stories and how were they in the end reported and what went well, what went badly. So first of all, I'm going to do this in chronological order. So I'm going to talk about the global financial crisis. And I think this exposed, as I can say, there are many failures in economic communications and a lot of failures in economics journalism, which I fully include myself in that before, certainly at the start of the crisis. Before I explain why, I'm going to tell you a short anecdote about a moment in 2008. We were there. This is the British Embassy in Washington, D.C. Beautiful gardens. This is in spring, I think, here, but it's obviously in autumn. I think it was about October the 8th, 2008. To put that into context, Lehman had happened, but RBS and Lloyds hadn't gone down in the UK yet. It was all very, it was very nerve-wracking, but people, the official view was things were going to be okay. Gordon Brown was saying there's no recession, there won't be a recession in this country. So that's roughly where we were at the time. And the reason you go to somewhere like the British Embassy at 7 in the morning, an ungodly hour, just before, this is the annual meetings of the International Monetary Fund and World Bank. So it's a big jamboree. Everyone in the world was there. There was G7, G20 meetings. Everyone knew that was quite a problem, but we often have in these meetings, it's 14 years on, so I'm going to betray some confidences here. You often have a completely hush-hush briefing with an official who I can't name, and I'm not going to name. And we're not even allowed to report it. Those are the terms of the briefing. And this official started the briefing with something like the following words. He said, what a lovely autumn morning it is here in DC. The weather reminds me of the first time I came to Washington 40 years ago. Little did I know that in 40 years' time, I'd be back dealing with the collapse of the entire banking system and the prospect of nationalising all UK banks. And, you know, so we sit there, and you know, then the rest of the briefing goes on to what he's going to be arguing for in the IMF meetings, etc. And at the end, you know, all of us sit around going, shall we use that? Can we use that? Really newsworthy. We really should be using that. But you know, it's a repeated game. If you shit all over, certainly someone who's really very important, it won't happen again. And they're very useful briefings. So we all decided collectively that we wouldn't, and we wouldn't use it. That was the agreement among all the people there. He shouldn't have said it, frankly. Especially at a time when we knew it was a self-fulfilling prophecy. If we wrote the story, it would happen. You know, so it really shouldn't have happened like that, but it certainly did happen. And we were all feeling quite responsible, so we decided, right, okay, we won't do it. And we all took the view, because we all have news desks, that we wouldn't, or most of us, except for one exception, took the view that we weren't even going to tell our news desks that this has happened, because they have quite a lot of power in news organisations, and if they would want to write it, then they might force you to do it. Except for one journalist who, I won't name him, but he worked at the Times at the time, and he clearly wrote an email to his news desk saying exactly what had happened, and they said, you've got to write it. And he said, no, I'm not going to write it. We have a deal. We're not going to write this. And then they said, well, we'll write it for you. You've just sent us all the information. And they did. And they've published it online. Luckily, it was 2008, not 2022. So the moment they publish online, a very short thing saying, I think something like G20 officials said, blah, 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 all hell breaks loose, because we shout at the Bank of England. We say, the Times have just put this up. We're going to have to do it as well. We can't not do it. We were all in the same room. The Bank of England is shouting at the Times, and the Times' news desk is shouting at the journalists, and everyone is shouting at him. And luckily, the Bank of England managed to bully the Times to take it down. It was up for 15 minutes, and everyone got away with it. It was a very, very close-run thing. And then they did recapitalise RBS and Lloyds in the week or two after that, but not the whole UK banking system. And there wasn't a self-fulfilling run on all of UK banks, which there would have been had that story come up. But anyway, that's just a digression. What about the financial crisis? Why am I so sort of down on economics communications beforehand? Well, because I think we were complicit in not challenging authority enough beforehand. The Queen asked sometime in 2009 when she toured London School of Economics, why did no one notice? And I think we were one of the reasons that, as it were, the intermediaries, the economics press, we were one of the reasons why no one noticed it. I mean, there's fault all round about people not sufficiently caring about financial stability. Because there had been years of economic stability, it encouraged pretty trivial journalism. So one of the games at the time at Bank of England quarterly press conferences was to try and get Mervyn King to say something rude about Ed Balls. I mean, that was one of the things we would do because it would generate a story. If you know, people like rows. Rows stories are good. So if you could get him, and you could get him, if you asked the question in the right way, you would get him to say something that was rude about Gordon Brown or Ed Balls, and that would be a news story. Actually, not an important one, but that's one of the things that was going on. We had a lot of deference to powerful people, so there seemed to be another game going on in all these press conferences, was to try and show how clever you were to the person you were asking the question, and do things like get the words Ricardian equivalents into a news story or something like that. It was all rather than actually hold people in important jobs to account. And I think we had a mission to explain. So we felt that our job was to try and translate the words of, Alan Greenspan when he said, "If you've understood me, then you've misunderstood me," or whatever he said, to explain and translate the language and the obfuscation of economic, the big people in economics to the general reader, rather than to be on the reader's side lots of ways and challenge them and say, well, why are you doing that? And more difficult questions. So I think we were part of the problem. But I think very quickly after the crisis struck, we also became part of the solution, and there was a sea change in the way that reporting worked. So there was rapid error correction from Northern Rock, big piece we did at the FT about everything Mervyn King got wrong, full tabloid treatment on Fred Goodwin, all these things. That's the sort of journalism that came out after the worst bit of it. And not taking big events on as the people who were delivering the information necessarily wanted. So in the London summit of 2009, Gordon Brown stood up and said how many trillions of dollars he had arranged for the global economy. And instead of writing this is a huge triumph and everything is solved, this is what we wrote at the time, April the 2nd, 2009. Figures at the end of any international summit need to be examined closely, particularly those presented by the UK Prime Minister. His reputation for numerical inflation, repeat announcement and double counting precedes him. Treasury were very cross with this piece. But that is, you do have to poke people a lot more, and it's the sort of thing that we do much more now and after the crisis than before. So the second story I want to come to is the austerity story. Now this is a difficult one because it's a really contentious issue. I don't think there's a right or wrong in this, so that's where I come from. I'll put my cards on the table. George Osborne and the coalition government decided to cut spending very hard in 2010, using phrases like, we're all in it together, our economic plan is working, and there were very eminent people who would support roughly what the government was doing, and there were very eminent people who said it was exactly the wrong thing to do, ranging from Ed Balls, obviously on the political sphere, too far, too fast, or the head of chief economist of the IMF at the time, Olivier Blanchard, who said the UK government was playing with fire. But I do think actually that in this, the debate was reported fairly, and it was very clear that there was a disagreement in the economics profession about exactly what the right thing to do. The profession was split. Well, we certainly was. We certainly did surveys of economists, and it was highly split, pretty much down the middle, and it's highly political as well, what was being done. And I think actually the reporting worked pretty well. And if you look at what's happened to the economy since the financial crisis, I mean, this is the classic UK economy graph of the period. So before the financial crisis, this is GDP growth with the pink line being the trend. Before the crisis, it grew roughly 2.5% a year. This is productivity, so this is per hour, I think. So 2%, that would be a trend, 2% growth rate. And after the crisis, well, almost zero, just about 0.5, bit less than that. And so the real economic problem is that we're poorer than we thought we were going to be as a country. And most countries suffered something like this, but we were worse than most other G7 countries in the change, in the delta here. And that meant we did have to tighten our belts to some extent. How fast we had to do it, who had to pay, should it have been done with public spending or higher taxes, those are all totally legitimate questions. But there was a need for some form of belt tightening because the only way you can suggest, I think, that isn't the case is if you think that the belt tightening itself caused the drop in productivity, but I think the evidence for that is pretty challenging to get that to work in the long term. So I think in the austerity debate, I'm doing this quite short, things worked pretty well. And that's not what I can say about Brexit. So what happened in Brexit? Let's just very quickly do the economics of Brexit in 2 sentences. In the long term, we're chucking some sand into the cogs of the economy by raising trade barriers with other countries. So we would expect to do slightly worse than we would otherwise do. It's a bit like a doctor saying, well, I can't tell you when you're going to die, but if you eat a pound of butter every day or smoke 40 cigarettes every day, you will die earlier than if you don't. And that's the long-term economics of Brexit. The short-term economics of Brexit at the referendum was don't really know, although that's not what the government said, but that was the economics was don't really know. So how did that land in as far as the public was concerned? Well, it was not very good. So there were some decent bits of trying to show the uncertainty. This is one thing we did at one time in 2015 or 16, early 16 I think, was we had some of the key data of the economy, and to try and show uncertainty, public don't like fan charts and stuff like that. But we scribbled it on, and we wrote it on with pen, just saying there's different scenarios of what could happen, and to show how uncertain it is, we just sort of drew it and then published it literally like that, which I thought was quite a fun thing to do. But this was the exception. So most of the reporting around Brexit was much more like war reporting, really. I've taken 2 Guardian pieces here. It would have been the same in the FT as well, but it's just sometimes easier. So you had on one side, house prices could fall 18% if Britain quits the EU, says Osborne. And then Leave campaign hits back with its own economists was the other thing. There was one side, the other side fighting. And lots of certainty in opinion columns, vote Leave to benefit from a world of opportunity, Telegraph's view, another Telegraph piece. Project Fear gets Carney on side, but it's still wrong, said Liam Halligan. What about the impartial media? BBC, terrible. This is ridiculous equivocation, so they did very much balancing, but this is my favourite piece of BBC journalism. Reality check. So this is this is the fact-checking part of the BBC. Should you care about economic models? With then a sort of a sexist picture of some fashion models. Economic models, are they like fashion models? No, they're a bit more realistic than that, but not much. What's that supposed to mean? A lot of people trying to decide whether to vote to leave the European Union or stay in want to know what would happen if the UK left. The trouble is we don't know. Honestly, we don't. And anyone who tells you that we do is lying. Well, that is not a great piece of economics journalism. And the war in media land continued after the referendum. So you've got a lot of pieces like this in the Brexit championing newspapers. Booming Britain proves Brexit fears unfounded. That continues to this day. And then even on very, very minor things, you would get very partisan reporting. So I've just taken as an example, I think these are the labour market figures from September 2017. On one hand, the Mail reported it as Britain, the job-making machine, unemployment hits a 42-year low as UK leads Europe. And the Evening Standard then was representing London, was very Remainery. UK pay squeeze on millions of families' living standards tightens, but employment at a record high. Both of these were true, because the figures were one of these ones where all of that was all the case in the data, but both of them didn't give a fair picture. I think our story on that day was really boring. It sort of tried to put both of them in the same sort of say pay squeeze, but employment really high or something. It was a very dull and short piece. But what did economics as a profession think of Brexit? Well, so that's how the media reported Brexit, in a short take. So let's have a look at the public understanding from what we know, because it was surveyed quite extensively. So first of all, economists were asked. I think it was 660, right at the bottom it says 639 economists in 2016 were surveyed about the impact of Brexit on the left the next 5 years and on the right the next 20 years. And very, very large majorities thought it was a bad, for the economics was bad. Doesn't mean you can't vote for it, but the economics was bad, which is the sort of thing that we were constantly reporting, that the profession thought it was a bad idea. Did this get across to the public? Well, these are surveys of the public. So a large majority thought that peace and stability on our continent would not be put at risk. A large majority thought the stability of Northern Ireland would not be put at risk. And an even larger majority thought that households won't lose £4,300 a year, which was the Treasury's number for the long-term impact, and will be permanently poorer. So economics entirely failed to get across the very much consensus view of economists about whether Brexit was good or bad for the long-term prosperity of the UK economy. What about the other side? So there was the Leave campaign had a slogan that let's stop sending £350 million a week to Brussels and spend it on the NHS instead. Now this number was actually just factually wrong. It was almost right, but it didn't even include. There was definitively a net contribution from the UK to the EU. There's no dispute about that, but the scale didn't include all the things that the UK got back, and certainly didn't even include the rebate. So we didn't even, in truth, send that amount of money as the gross contribution, because we didn't send that amount of money and then get money back in other forms. But the public, a large majority of the public has heard of it, and a smaller majority of the public thought it was true as well, when it was definitively not true. What did they think about the long term? Again, the public thought that they thought there might be some pain in the short term, but over the longer term, the economy would do better, 39 to 35. And I think very importantly, when you asked about your own circumstances, the biggest group there was most people thought it would make no difference to them. So they weren't actually that engaged. There was this huge debate out there, but they weren't that engaged. So what went wrong? Well, I think there was, the subject was complicated. We're talking about forecasts of the future. We're talking about counterfactuals. There was a huge amount of very motivated reporting. There was exploitation of media rules, in particularly in the broadcast media, which had impartiality rules. So you had to, in a referendum, give equal weight to one side and the other. So that made it feel as if it was just a one-sided. One person says this, one person says that. And a lot of economists cowered. The public were also not that interested. It didn't really matter to them right now. There's all this sort of odd argument about income foregone. They couldn't see it. They thought people were arguing about, have you lost 4,000 quid, or rather than would you in 15 years be significantly poorer than you otherwise would be. So it was complicated, and a lot of the economics profession sort of just hid in a bunker. And the people who didn't, there's good reasons why they did, because some of the people who didn't got absolutely abused when they put their heads above the parapet. So that is an example when communication, just about getting the subject across to people, went badly wrong. But I'd like to end on a happier note. So COVID, how did that go in the sort of the economic sphere? And I think I'm really rather positive about how we reported the COVID crisis and the economics of it, and how the public, how it came across. So one thing that was obvious to me and to certainly economics journalists very, very early on in the crisis, March and April 2020, was that we ended up doing quite a lot of reporting on the health numbers. So these are two people in my team, me and a colleague of mine, Ed Conway at Sky. We're doing a lot of reporting on deaths and case numbers. Why is that? Well, because economic skills were rather good at dealing with data, and particularly data with uncertainty when you don't know what exactly was underlying it, and inference from rather difficult data sources. And so we were suddenly very central to a story, even on the health side. There was no doubt the story was huge. So very early in the crisis, again, April the 3rd, writing a piece, Global Economy Set for the Sharpest Reversal Since the Great Depression, we were writing, and lovely things like this New York Times front page, where this was jobless claims, and they just took the whole right-hand side of the paper to show that it was really quite unprecedented. Oh, and it went back to, I think, the 1950s or something like that. It was a lovely, lovely piece of journalistic design. You could see that policy was responding really quickly in all countries. So we had Sunak announced the furlough scheme on March the 20th. So again, that was before lockdown. It was just after the announcement of it, I can't remember, around the same sort of time. It was 9 days after the budget, which was on March the 11th, and it was designed in 2 days in the Treasury, and it showed an amazing ability of the economics profession to do something really quickly when push came to shove. And I remember I had that story about Gordon Brown and the billions and trillions that he was claiming had been mobilised in the global economy in 2009. Well, that amounted, on the most generous definition, as a fiscal stimulus of 2% of national income. Very quickly, advanced economies spent 11% or so in the COVID crisis. So lots of the debates about what to do when had been solved, and countries moved incredibly quickly. Also, data provision took a generational leap forward in a very, very short space of time. So we now have a weekly indicators publication from the ONS, which is very good. You can see exactly what's going on in various sectors. A lot of it is just a little bit random. You don't want to treat one piece of data as gospel. And also private sector providers as well. This is Open Table, looking at the restaurant bookings on a daily basis. You get it up to the day before, and they just put it online. You just have to know where it looks. Lots of other airline flights, all these things are now available in ways they just weren't. And the public were hugely interested as well. So obviously, because they all thought they were losing their jobs, and in America, very, very large numbers did initially lose their jobs. And generally got pretty good economic debates and understood it pretty well. So we saw there was a huge debate on the economic effect of lockdowns, which was quite vociferal. Although people are arguing on both sides, and some bits of the government still suggest there's a huge trade-off between lives and livelihoods. But it was generally seen that it was the virus that was causing both the lockdown and then the lockdown causing the economic downturn, not just, you wouldn't have been fine if you didn't have a lockdown, and Sweden wasn't fine when it had a much less draconian policies. But these trade-offs changed when there was a vaccine, and I think, again, the public, this was explained pretty well, both from politicians and through the media, and the public have understood that pretty well. We've got a much better sense of the appropriate scale of fiscal stimulus, and it's been a huge debate in the US in particular, where they've clearly gone too far, and it's now creating an inflation problem, which the Biden administration is having to deal with, and it silenced, what was very popular 2 years ago, the MMT crowd, which I don't think is a bad thing. Some interesting debates about should you subsidise jobs or subsidise people. European differences of approach there, and at different times, different parts of that have looked better. So at the moment, the European approach looks better, but that's not always been the case, and the US has had a stronger recovery from COVID than European countries. And how should economies balance the big questions of resilience, so in supply chains, in numbers of beds you have available in hospitals, against optimization, and those are sort of big debates which we still have to get our heads around in the months and years ahead. Public engagement was I think pretty decent. There was an understanding of the seriousness of the situation, little challenge over the need for massive stimulus. This wouldn't have happened in 2010-11. It would have been, there'd been a huge worries about what's happening to the public finances, rather than saying this is what government is about. When there is a crisis, it's the only actor in society who can step in. There was an acceptance of the initial economic value of lockdowns and how that changed with vaccination. Of course, there was some silliness out there. Eat out to help out, silly debates. Work from home, still silly debate. You're always going to get some of that. But I think the overall effect of both the economic analysis and the communication of it has been really successful. So I'm now going to give you, those are my 4 stories. I'll just conclude with a sort of an analytical more than a prescriptive thought or two. So I think I've explained that communicating economics is a messy business. There's lots of players. They have complicated incentives, and those incentives change at different times. For example, the media was far too soft before the financial crisis. Austerity was a difficult economic issue and highly partisan. Brexit was a disaster, but by contrast, COVID was a bit of a triumph. So what separates triumph from disaster? This is what I think you need. So in a classic Venn diagram, you've got three parties here. You have, let's say, you have good economics journalism, you have an engaged economics profession, and that includes public sector, private sector, academics, everyone, and an interested public. And if you have all three, economics communication can be pretty effective, I think. And that is what happened, I think, in both the coronavirus crisis and in the austerity debate. It's not what happened in the global financial crisis. I think the public were interested in the stability of their economy, but frankly we weren't, and nor was the profession, beforehand at least. And Brexit, you had none of the above. And so my less than cheerful conclusion, I think, is that we do need to call out bad economics journalism when it exists, and I certainly try and do that because we want to always be in that circle of good economics journalism. I think the profession needs to take engagement more seriously and think about how to use language in a way that interests and keeps the public as engaged as it can be. And it'd be great to think the public should be interested, but we can't necessarily expect them always to be so. But those are our defences, I think, against a bad outcome. And sometimes, we just it just won't work. And I think we have to accept that. And we don't live in a perfect world. But with that slightly gloomy final thought, I will leave it there and take your questions. Thank you very much.